What is tragedy? In this video, we'll be looking at some of the principal terms used in discussing Greek tragedy, though many of them will also be useful in analysing works from later periods. Our first term is anagnorisis, recognition. This is one of the terms that Aristotle uses in his Poetics, along with peripeteia, reversal, to describe the trajectory, the shape of the tragic plot. And he thinks that it is characteristic of tragedy that towards the end of the play there should be a form of recognition. Now sometimes this might take the form of a character recognizing the identity of someone who has previously been unknown or disguised. But perhaps more profoundly, it may involve a character recognizing the true nature of their own actions. For example, towards the end of Sophocles' play Oedipus the King, Oedipus is brought to recognize that he is the son of Laios and Jocasta. He's also brought to recognize that he has killed Laios and married Jocasta. And throughout the play, he has been pursuing the murderer of Laios without knowing who that was, because the gods have said that the plague afflicting Thebes is a retribution on the city for harbouring Laios' murderer, and he finally is brought to recognise that he himself is that murderer. It's he himself who has been the object of his investigations all along. Catharsis. This is another of Aristotle's words, and literally it just means purging. It seems to have been primarily a medical term. Aristotle uses it when he is discussing in his Poetics the way in which tragedy typically seems to arouse in the audience feelings of pity and fear. Pity for undeserved misfortune, he says, and fear for the downfall of someone like ourselves. But exactly what he means by purging is not really clear. Probably he means that the action of tragedy will first of all stir up these emotions in an audience and then will purge them in the sense of reducing them to their proper extent. Tragedy therefore achieves a kind of harmony in the audience. Our next word is daimon, from which we get the English word demon. But in Greek, daimon does not imply an evil spirit. It's simply a supernatural agent, some kind of spirit, perhaps a god, whose identity we can't be sure of. It's a divine power which at that point in the play, at any rate, has no name. Demos, the people, from which we derive our word democracy. Tragedy was in its origins an Athenian form, and the Athenians prided themselves on their democracy, rule by the people, rather than rule by a king. Dike is justice, and this is a very contentious idea in many of the plays. For example, in Aeschylus' Oresteia, several characters claim to be acting according to justice, but very often they seem to be invoking the notion of justice in order to provide a cover, a justification for their own self-interest and their own actions. At the end of the Oresteia, Aeschylus shows us the city of Athens under the guidance of the goddess Athene, trying to establish a new form of social and collective justice, which will displace what has in effect been a retributive form of justice, almost a kind of vengeance or vendetta that we have seen operating throughout the play up to that point. The Erinyes are the Furies. Their appearance is that of female figures, horrible to look upon, very frightening, and their function is to avenge the killings that take place particularly within families, and they are often implementing a mother's or a father's curse. We come across the Furies in Aeschylus's Oresteia at the beginning of the third play in the trilogy, the Eumenides. There they are pursuing Orestes for the murder of his own mother, Clytemnestra. But at the end of that play, they are eventually persuaded by Athene to take up a different function, to move away from the pursuit of criminals to a function within the city which will nurture and bless the city to make it fruitful. So their presence is converted really from one which pursues vengeance to one which nurtures social harmony. And they are given a new name. They are given the name Eumenides, the kindly ones. And it's not only at the end of the Oresteia that we meet the Furies in their transformed role of Eumenides, because in Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus, when he arrives at Colonus, he finds himself in a sacred grove which is dedicated to the Eumenides. At the end of his terrible journey, he finds the kindly ones. Hamartia is an error, a mistake. It's the word that Aristotle uses in the Poetics to describe that action which precipitates the fall of the protagonist. It's a terrible error of judgment. Sometimes people refer to this as a fatal flaw, but that doesn't seem to be quite what Aristotle is thinking about. For him, it appears that hamartia is an error of judgment. It's an action. It's something that someone does. It's not primarily an aspect of their character or psychology or personality, which might be suggested by the term fatal flaw. It's something that might be generated by an aspect of their character, but it seems to be an action, a decision, not part of their psychology. And one kind of hamartia, which we often find in tragedy, is hubris, arrogance, insolence, excessive pride. But a special kind of pride. The kind of pride that leads a human being to consider themselves to be more than human. For example, to take credit for something which should really be attributed to the gods. It's the kind of pride that leads a person to cross the boundary between what is proper to humans and what is proper to the gods. An example of hubris might be the behaviour of Hippolytus in Euripides' play, where he says that he has no interest in women sexually, but he expresses that in terms which insult Aphrodite, the goddess of love. He wants nothing to do with her. That kind of arrogance and insolence is a form of hubris, and hubris in the Greek world leads to nemesis, retribution, divine anger. And this is sometimes personified as a goddess, Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. Mimesis, mimesis in Greek, is imitation. And Aristotle begins his account of tragedy by saying that tragedy is the imitation of an action, though we use the word mimesis rather more broadly in literary studies for any kind of imitation, representation. Moira is fate, one's portion in life, that which is allotted to you and which, whatever you do, you cannot change. Nostos is the word used for the return home. Perhaps the most famous return home is that of Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey. At the end of the Trojan War, Odysseus returns home, but he does so to find that his home is, in a sense, no longer his home, because his wife Penelope is being pestered by suitors who want her to marry one of them. Another example of the difficult, indeed in this case traumatic return home, is the return of Agamemnon to his house at Argos in the Oresteia. And this perhaps prompts us to reflect that home is often in tragedy a complex concept. After all, where is Oedipus's home? What is his point of origin? And of course those are not really quite the same question. At the outset he would have said that his home was Corinth, but he comes to discover that his home is Thebes, and yet this is no kind of home in the sense of being a comfortable place. It is quite the opposite. Both Oedipus and Agamemnon, and indeed Odysseus, find that home is not a place of safety, but a place of danger, which might lead us to turn to Freud's essay on the uncanny, where he explores the way in which, in German, the word heimlich means not only homely and familiar, but what is concealed and hence hidden and dangerous. And indeed tragedy often shows us that the space which we think of as home may be unstable and may have the potential to turn into something foreign and dangerous. And by space here we can imagine that we are talking about both a literal and a conceptual space. The literal place, home, may turn out to be unstable, but so too the conceptual space, the framework of ideas and beliefs and values within which we live, may also be made unstable through the action of tragedy. Moving on from the idea of the home and the homecoming, we come to oikos, which is the house or the household. So it's not just the building, it's the community that inhabits that house. And in many tragedies there is an attention to the household. The Oresteia, for example, is not only staged in front of the house of Agamemnon, which forms literally the backdrop to the stage action. It also reminds us that the household of Agamemnon has a complex and dark history, stretching back to his father Atreus, who killed his own brother and the brother's children. And so we are made aware that the focus of the play is not just on the action of an individual, Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, later Orestes, but on the whole sense of what constitutes the family, the collective memory, and perhaps indeed the collective or inherited guilt. I said that there might be a kind of reversal of expectations attached to the home and homecoming. And that is perhaps one example of peripeteia, Aristotle's term for reversal. And along with recognition, reversal is one of the characteristics that he identifies as a key element in the shape of the tragic plot. It's particularly an unexpected change in fortune, and the stories of Agamemnon or Oedipus, for example, are very good instances of reversal. As well as the focus on the oikos, the household, tragedy in its Athenian form is often very interested in the polis, the city. And from the Greek word polis, obviously we get our words politics and policy. The polis, the city, is particularly important in Sophocles' Antigone, where Antigone is presented with two forms of duty. She has a duty to bury her brother Polynices, but she also has a duty to the city, which has been attacked by Polynices. So Polynices has been declared an enemy to the city. So what is Antigone's loyalty? What form does it take? Loyalty to the brother and the family, or loyalty to the city, the polis? And now we come to psychomachia. The Greek word really just means desperate struggle, but more specifically the term is used in English to denote a mental struggle. Etymologically it comes from the Greek psyche, mind, and mache, battle. This is the kind of battle in which the mind is divided against itself. And perhaps we can see this in the libation bearers of Aeschylus, where Orestes confronts Clytemnestra before he kills her. He is undecided as to what he should do. Should he avenge his father or respect his mother? He can't do both. And dramatically, we find a very clear instance of this divided mind in Marlowe's play Dr. Faustus, where Faustus is accompanied on stage by a good angel and an evil angel, a dramatic personification of the psychomachia that is going on in his own mind. Our last word is tyrannos, from which we get the English word tyrant. In Greek the word means lord or king, and it seems that it was originally applied to someone who made himself king by force rather than inheritance, and from that meaning it's easy to see how later it was used in a sense approximating to our own use of tyrant. This was an idea that would have appealed quite strongly to the Athenians, who, as I said earlier, prided themselves on their form of government by the people, or at any rate by adult male citizens, rather than government by an individual, a single tyrannos. The Greek title of Sophocles' play is Oedipus Tyrannos, Oedipus the king, Oedipus the ruler, not, of course, Oedipus the tyrant in our sense, but it does focus our attention on the strong individuality, the strong presence of Oedipus as a single ruler, which is so important in the course of the play. Here now are a few brief notes on some of the principal gods and goddesses whom we encounter in Greek tragedy. Aphrodite, the goddess of sexual love, is particularly important, as I said earlier, in Euripides' play Hippolytus, where she is rejected by the protagonist, and at the end of the play it becomes very clear that she has been responsible for his destruction, punishing him for his lack of respect. Apollo is the sun god, the god of music and poetry and prophecy and healing. And in Aeschylus' Oresteia, he is the champion of Orestes. It is Apollo who urges, or indeed commands, Orestes to carry out the murder of Clytemnestra in response to Clytemnestra's killing of Agamemnon. Artemis is the goddess of chastity and of hunting, and at the beginning of the Oresteia, or rather in the backstory to the Oresteia, it appears that Agamemnon has offended her, and it is in order to bring about the favour of Artemis, which will lead to the winds changing and allowing the fleet to sail to Troy, that Agamemnon is persuaded to sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia. Athene is the goddess of wisdom and of the arts. She is the patron of Athens, and she takes the guiding role at the end of the Oresteia in establishing a form of judicial process which will incorporate the Eumenides as goddesses of nurturing rather than vengeance. Dionysus, whom the Romans called Bacchus, is the god of wine and intoxication. The dramatic festival at Athens in which the tragedies were performed was held in the honour of the god Dionysus. And then we have Zeus, who is the supreme Olympian god and is important in the Oresteia as the protector of hospitality, hospitality which was violated, of course, by Paris when he went off with Helen, the wife of Menelaus, who was his host.